Eric, thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate your time and putting this presentation together.
You're welcome. Good morning, everybody. And thanks for having me. My name is Eric Sexton, and I am a registered appraiser by the state of Oregon, which gives me the authority to do real property appraisals for assessment purposes. And so I've been doing this for going on 21 years. I started over in Grant County. I did that for about 3 years, which was a good place to learn. But besides me and the assessor and a small staff, I was the only appraiser there. So a lot of experience there to start off. But then I moved here to Deschutes County, and I've been here for the last 17 years. And along with all the duties I have being a property appraiser, I also oversee all the special assessment tax deferral programs. Just a little bit about me personally. I'm originally from the Oregon City area outside Portland. I reside here in Bend. I live here with my wife and my 2 kids, daughter Robin, who's 8, and my son Jasper, who's 4. So let's get into it here. So yeah, today's purpose of the talk is to go over the special assessment programs that are potentially eligible to properties in Oregon. So what I'm going to go over is this applies to all the counties in Oregon, statewide. The workings of the Oregon property tax system are kind of can be complicated. A lot of ins and outs, a lot of what you guys don't really need to know about. So what I'm going to talk about hopefully focuses on the parts that will benefit you guys the most. This is based on years of talking to agents, title company buyers on the phone, and the most common questions and stuff like that. So there's six programs I'm going to hopefully get over. Definitely the first 4 are the most common ones. There's exclusive farm use deferral, non-exclusive farm use deferral, there's wildlife deferral, and forest land deferral. And 2 of the least common ones is called open space deferral and conservation easement special assessment deferral. And before I quite dive into that, I'm just going to go over what does deferral mean, make sure we're all on the same page. So all properties in Oregon have an assessed value. But when a land qualifies for a special assessed tax deferral program, the land receives a special assessed value that is generally much lower than its normally assessed value. And that's where the benefit comes in. Tax rates applied to that lower value results in lower taxes. But it's not an exemption. It's a deferral. It's deferring what it normally would be paying on the land, less what it is paying on the land based on the special assessed value. And that deferral could come back in the future if for some reason it ever came out of the program, and some of those deferred taxes could become due. And I will definitely go over some of that. So one of the most common ones to start with is exclusive farm use deferral. So this is for properties that are zoned exclusive farm use. And my format for each of these kind of be the same. I'll go over qualifications, what new owners should know, what could result in disqualification, and how the back taxes are related to that, or the deferred taxes. So EFU deferral, or exclusive farm use deferral, must be zoned EFU. And to qualify or to be in compliance, the land must be used for farm use, a qualifying farm use, with the intent to make a profit from that farm use. So there is no dollar threshold they have to meet. They have to be attempting to sell it, but they could be losing money on it. They could be breaking even. As long as they're attempting to sell it, that's compliance. There can be personal use along with that, but that can't be the main farm use on there. The main use needs to be selling that farm use. It starts with an application process, followed up by an appraiser like myself doing a field inspection, confirming the farm use on the property. And a property can qualify anytime during the year. There's no deadline for that up until we certify the roll at the end of the year. And once the property qualifies, the land receives a special assessed value, and that value is going to be based on farm leases and soil class. And these special assessed values, they can range from $10 an acre up to $1,000 an acre, but generally a lot less than what its normal assessed value would be. Again, that's the reduction comes from reduces the taxes. For a new owner, the EFU deferral status can transfer promoter and owner. They do not need to reapply. It comes with the property. They would get a brief questionnaire from us being a new owner, asking them what their intent is going forward as far as how they're going to use it for farm use. So it's us kind of reminding them it's in farm deferral. They need to use it for farm use and asking them how they're going to use it. They can stick with the prior use the owner was doing, or they can change it to another farm use. That's not a problem. And after that, after they purchase the property and give us the new owner questionnaire, they do not need to submit anything to our office unless we request it. So I always recommend the new owners keep their own personal file of their farm use records, purchases and sales and whatnot. So what would cause the property to come out of deferral or disqualification? Well, non-compliance is probably one of the most common ones. That would be not using the property for farm use with the intent to make a profit. Our office does do audits most year, and they're not random audits. We usually have a pretty good reason why we think we need to review the property. We've obtained some information ourselves or from outside sources that the property's not being used. So if that's the case, we reach out to the owners, we send them letters, make contact, do site visits, try to start a dialogue with them. And if it's not in compliance, we give them time to comply. But if that doesn't happen, if they don't choose to comply, that would result in our office sending a notice of disqualification. More often than not, property owners try to comply on that. A more common one, especially in Deschutes County, is the approval for a non-farm dwelling on an EFU zone property. So when an undeveloped property that's zoned exclusive farm use, and it's in farm deferral, if it's approved for a non-farm dwelling, prior to them getting a building permit, that property has to be disqualified from farm deferral and the related back taxes paid. And that's not always the case for EFU zone properties. Some properties can qualify for a farm dwelling. It's just pretty steep. This is a planning department's call, but it can range from having to prove 2 years of farm use and grossing $40,000 to $80,000 income from farm use, which for Deschutes County, a lot of these small hobby farms, just not possible to do. So the non-farm dwelling is their best option if they want to build. Or the property might have an existing home on there that predates the rules, and someone wants to build a new home, they can get a replacement dwelling. That does not require the property to come out of deferral. It's typically when it's undeveloped land in deferral and they want to build a home and it gets a non-farm dwelling approval, it has to come out. And along with coming out, it's a permanent disqualification from the program. So it's no longer eligible for farm deferral. It can be used for farm use, that's allowed, just no longer eligible. So in rural parts of Deschutes County, their EFU zone, you can have lots of properties side by side, all of them active farm use, some in deferral, some not. And the main reason that's going to be probably is because the house on there is an approved non-farm dwelling. Another reason it could come out more obvious is if there's a change of use away from farm use, such as being developed or some kind of commercial or industrial use being implemented. The owner can request it to come out. Partitions may or may not require it to come out of deferral. If the parcels being created from the partition are non-farm parcels, non-farm dwellings, yes, they have to be disqualified at that time. If that's not the case, if they're just partitioned in the lots, they can remain in the program as long as they're still being used for farm use. Lot line adjustments don't require any disqualification. The recording of a subdivision plat, you would think it would, but the recording of a subdivision plat does not disqualify it at that time. It can still be used for farm use, but up to the point when they start to develop the property, that's the change of use, and at that time it could come out. So you could record a plat this year and it could stay in for the next 2 years, and then you develop the property, it comes out at that time. So what's the rub? What's the hit on that? So farm deferral, EFU zone, if it comes out, it's 10 years back of deferred taxes. And that's despite ownership. And some kind of strange rules about whether those are due or not in this scenario. If an EFU zone property comes out for farm deferral just for non-compliance, we have to calculate the 10 years of deferred taxes, and we post it as potential tax liability on the property, but it's not due. It's not due and collectible at that time because there really hasn't been a change of use to the property away from farm use. It's just not being used for farm use. So it'll just kind of sit out there. No interest is applied to it, and it can be paid off at any time voluntarily, of course. So you're going to see properties out there, and you'll see it on our public records. Will be a notation, potential tax liability, and a dollar amount next to it. That typically means it came out of deferral at one time. Those are the back taxes because of that, waiting for somebody to pay it off. And a change of ownership does not require that to be paid on our end. It comes with the property. So if it's a scenario like that, it's really up to between the buyer and the seller or the parties involved if that's to be paid off upon transfer of ownership. Now, cases where like the non-farm dwelling approval or being developed into homes or change of use, if that happens, then the taxes are due at that time for the property. A little bit at the end here, this is going to be the same for a lot of the deferral programs I talked about. So who's responsible for paying deferred taxes? Well, the deferred taxes are tied to the land, not ownership. So our office has no authority to say who would be responsible for paying any potential back taxes. It's just tied to the land. Like I said earlier, if you come across one of these that was in deferral at one time and came out for non-compliance, it could be potential tax liability dollar amount posted to that. And if it's selling, that's on the public record. And if they want that cleared up, that needs to be negotiated. Because on our end, we're not going to say it's due just because it changes ownership. But if someone wanted to know what that potential back tax could be, if it's property actively enrolled before they buy it, I can provide a high-low estimate at any time. They just need to reach out to me or our office and give them a high-low estimate of just what that would be for due diligence purposes. I can tell them that. If they need an exact amount, we can do that as well. We do charge a $75 fee because it does take more time to calculate it back for each year. And we would calculate that upon being paid the fee for that. And the fees, because we used to do it for no fee, people would ask for it, we'd put the work in, and then they never come get the amount from us. Briefly, what would happen if a property did come out of deferral? The land's going to get reappraised at current market value, and a new assessed value is going to be created based on that. So the property is going to see an increase in taxes going from being in farm deferral and coming out. It's difficult to tell owners what those taxes are going to be going forward because there's just a few unknowns. I don't know what the market value is going to be. I don't know what the tax rate is going to be. But we do have a few tools that we can help work with property owners to try to estimate what that would be. And with that said, whatever our office does put on there when it comes out of deferral, it's not set in stone. If the property owner thinks it's too high, they can request a review, or they can also do an official appeal. So whatever it ends up being, we can still look at the value and make sure it's right after the fact. That's the main stuff on exclusive farm use deferral. I think we said you'd wait till the end for questions. I could take them now on this one if you want, or we could wait till.
It looks like you covered it perfectly. There are no questions. You nailed it.
You guys listening? All right. Next one, the other farm deferral program is the non-exclusive farm use deferral. So the only difference is this is eligible to any property zone something other than exclusive farm use. Rural residential, multiple use agriculture, any other zoning is eligible for this program. The qualifications are just a little different. To qualify or to be in compliance, there has to be farm use on the property, current farm use and previous year farm use on the property. And the main difference is these ones have to meet a gross income requirement from the farm use. And it's based on acreage. So a property from 0 to 6.5 acres, the gross income requirement is $650. 6.5 acres to 30 acres is $100 an acre. And anything over 30 acres, the gross income is $3,000. It caps at that. And once it's qualified, the property owners need to continue to meet those requirements. And first-time applicants, there is an application process, April 1st deadline. Just like the previous farm deferral program, the EFU one, once it qualifies, the land receives a special assessed value based on farm leases in soil class. Similar to the EFU, the new owners, if it's a new owner, the deferral transfers from owner to owner. It comes with the property. There's no requirement to reapply, no new application required. They also will get a new owner questionnaire from us asking how they intend to use the property for farm use going forward. But they also should know, they need to know that going forward, every 3 years, our office does do an audit if our workload allows, which it usually does. And every 3 years, we're going to send out a questionnaire asking for farm use from the previous 3 years and the gross income from that farm use, along with documentation to support that gross income. So this one, I definitely stress to new owners, keep a good personal record of mainly your sales, whatever your farm use is. So when you get these questionnaires, it makes it a lot easier just to pull that stuff out from the previous years. And we're not going to be asking for years they didn't own the property. It'll just be focused on the years that they did own it. So what would trigger that to come out of deferral or non-exclusive farm use deferral? Well, mainly non-compliance. If as a result of one of our audits or reviews that there's failure to prove it's been used for farm use and failure to meet the gross income requirements, our office would most likely have to disqualify the property. Of course, any change of use away from farm use would trigger that. The owner can request to come out at any time. Partitions would not necessarily disqualify a property. A property can be partitioned that's in non-EFU deferral. And as long as the newly created parcels remain to meet the requirements, they can stay in. Same with lot line adjustments. That doesn't require any disqualification. A recording of a subdivision plat would result. Unlike the EFU zone ones where a recording itself, the act of recording doesn't trigger a disqualification. For non-EFU properties, the act of recording the subdivision plat would require it to come out at that time, even if it hasn't been developed yet. One big difference too between non-EFU deferral and EFU deferral is non-EFU deferral is not subject to the non-farm dwelling approval. Approval and construction of a dwelling does not warrant disqualifying the property if it's non-EFU zoned. But if it did come out, what's the back tax liability? Well, for non-EFU, it's 5 years back. Similar to EFU, if it just comes out for non-compliance, it's just posted as a potential tax liability. No interest is applied to it, and it's going to sit out there until someone volunteers to pay it off. A change of ownership is not required to be paid on our end, but again, it can be voluntarily paid off. The times when it would be due is if there is it is a change of use to the property, like being developed or something away from farm use, making it incompatible to go back to farm use. Then our office could post those as due at that time. Try not to repeat myself again. Who's responsible for paying those? It's tied to the land, not ownership. So we have no say in who's responsible for paying those taxes. Again, I can provide, for due diligence purposes beforehand, I can always provide a high-low estimate or an exact amount for a fee. And once it comes out, it's going to be reassessed at current market value, a new assessed value created based on that.
We do have a couple of questions.
Okay.
Can we field those now?
Yeah.
Okay. So we have a question about what type of documentation is required to show proof of use. Is that a P&L, tax statement, photographic evidence? What does that look like?
Right. Yeah, very good question. Our office is pretty open to almost any type of documentation. Preferably it would show the date, how much money was exchanged between the names of the parties involved. The best documentation is the Schedule F. That's reporting income from farm use when you report your income taxes, because that shows right on there what your gross income was. That's the most official. That's the best documentation that for some reason, if the property got disqualified and it got contested, if that was taken to tax court, that'd be the best thing for the property owner to have on there. We can't make anybody file Schedule Fs, but if they do, that's great. Auction receipts, personal ledgers, like I said, we're pretty open to it. To any kind of documentation. So, but it is required.
Perfect. So that answers, I think, the next question that says what kind of farm use records are required? The same. So what is the fee to obtain the estimated amount due?
An estimate, nothing. I can do an estimate for free, pretty quick, and email it, a copy of that. And an actual amount is $75 fee. Calculate
Perfect.
that, and we calculate that upon payment of the fee.
One more, is the deferral on the entire property or only the acreage that is used for farm use in this circumstance?
Typically it's the entire property. We will create a 1 acre home site that's not in deferral. And that's not specifically mapped out 1 acre. It's meant to encompass the house, like the personal yard, the driveway, stuff like that. But usually the remainder of the property is enrolled. That gets the property owner the max benefit of the program tax-wise. But it can be property specific. Some people only apply to have a few acres enrolled, but most people apply the whole thing. And that usually works for us because we know that some properties have incidental areas that are low, not very productive. Some are very productive, but it's all part of the farm operation. And there's statute that allows that to be the case where we can enroll all the acres in deferral as part of the whole operation.
And then we had a question regarding, is it F or S for taxes?
Not sure what you mean.
I'm not sure either. The Schedule F,
Oh,
the
Schedule
filing
F,
of the,
as in Frank. Yeah.
yes,
Schedule
yes,
F. Yeah.
yes, or S as in Sam.
Right. Yeah. F as in
Who was
Frank.
that?
Schedule F. Yeah.
F, okay. Does farm use include cattle?
Yeah, most definitely. As long as that as they're selling it. If you're just raising it for your own personal consumption and not making any money off it, technically that wouldn't be considered farm use. So, but yeah, raising livestock for sale, definitely. The information flyers, hopefully you got the information flyers. If not, I can always get them to you. They spell out what qualifies as farm use on there.
Yeah, thank you for sending those. We'll be following up with everyone on
Okay.
this call with,
Okay.
yep, with all of those, yep. Okay, perfect. I think that answers all the questions we have for now on that portion.
Okay, yeah, good questions. So moving on to wildlife deferral. I did mention earlier that what I'm talking about is statewide, it's the same statewide. But when the wildlife deferral program was adopted, they made it an option for the counties to either opt in or opt out. I'd say a little less than half did. Deschutes County was one of the counties that opted to take it on. So to qualify for wildlife deferral, it's not eligible to all properties. The property has to be zoned exclusive farm use or zoned forest. An application does need to be submitted to us, but along with that, it has to have an approved wildlife management plan that's been approved by the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. So the property owner that's interested in this, they have to reach out to the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife and with one of their biologists who would first determine if they think the property is a good fit for the program. And if they do think it's a good fit, they would develop a wildlife management program specific for that property. And if that's the case, they notify us, they apply, and if it qualifies, tax-wise, the land's going to be specially assessed as if it were in farm deferral. So it's going to get that reduction in assessed value in that way. For new owners, comes with the property. So a new owner or the wildlife deferral status, it can transfer from owner to owner. They do not need to reapply for that. It's good practice though for the new owner to get a copy of the approved wildlife management plan because they would be required to continue to implement whatever that plan states. If a new property owner intends to make any changes to the property that's not mentioned in the plan, it's good practice to reach out to ODF and W first and ask about that, because they may view that as a non-compliance. Depends on what it is. And there has been cases where that's been the situation where ODF and W is open to amending the plan for that. Or there's been scenarios where they say, no, that's a flat out in non-compliance issue. And that kind of leads to what would disqualify a wildlife deferral program. Well, non-compliance. So if the property is governed by the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, they do the site inspections and monitor those. But if they find that a property is not in compliance with the plan, the property owner is given 6 months to comply. So a pretty good chunk of time to comply, 6 months. But after that 6 months, if the property fails to comply, then that's going to result in ODF and W notifying us to disqualify the property. The property owner can also request to come out at any time. Partitions and lot line adjustments, the act of that itself on my end was not disqualify it, but that could be deemed by ODF and W as a non-compliance issue. So that potentially could result in disqualification. The recording of a subdivision plat definitely would result in disqualification at that time. Much like the non-EFU deferral, properties and wildlife deferral are not subject to the non-farm dwelling approval disqualification. So if you got a property that's zoned exclusive farm use, a bare piece of ground that's in the wildlife deferral, you can get approved for a non-farm dwelling. And as long as that's approved in the wildlife management plan beforehand, that they agreed they could build a home somewhere on the property, that does not trigger it to come out of deferral. But if it ever did come out of the wildlife deferral, if they wanted to switch to farm use for some reason, it sold and new owners wanted to do horse boarding or something like that, it would come out of wildlife deferral and would not be eligible for farm deferral because that is a non-farm dwelling. They have the option to do those uses, but not be in the farm deferral status. If it did come out, the back taxes, if it's wildlife deferral property zoned EFU, it's a 10-year look back, despite ownership for those 10 years. If it's zoned forest, it's a 5-year look back, and despite ownership during those years. And those would always be due at that time. They're not going to sit out there as a tax liability like the farm deferral. Those would be due for that given year that they're disqualified. Who's responsible for paying those taxes? Again, tied to the land, not ownership. It's between the parties involved. If there's taxes due, who would have to pay those taxes? Again, the land would be reassessed based on current market value once it came out. And don't know what that would be, but we always open to working with property owners to try to estimate what that might be going forward and what their options are once it becomes, a value on the roll if they disagree with it.
We have one question that popped up. What kind of features on a property would qualify for a wildlife deferral?
Well, I don't. That's a hard one for me to answer. I'm not a biologist. Every property is different, so that's kind of their call. They seem to, my experience, ODF and W seems to like large acreage. I don't know if they have an acreage cutoff, a personal cutoff. Large acreage, preferably property that doesn't have extensive agricultural use on it. So it seems like properties that are mostly in a natural state seem to be preferred. And depending on, it could be they want them to thin out junipers, create brush piles, plant more different types of trees or plants, create bird boxes, remove fencing. Could be a variety of things that the owner would be required to do. It's going to be kind of property specific.
So that was another question that you basically answered, if there are size limits to the properties in a wildlife management program.
Yeah, I think there are. They haven't told me what it is, but I think there is. So they'd want to reach out to them to do that. I should have mentioned that since it's eligible to property zoned EFU, property and farm deferral could roll over into wildlife deferral if they were approved by ODF and W. No disqualification occurring. They could just roll over from one program to the next. So
Would there be
guess
a price difference or I mean,
no, it wouldn't, because properties in wildlife deferral are especially assessed as if in farm deferral. But it'd just be a different set of requirements. They wouldn't have to farm the property anymore if they want to get away from that.
got it.
It'd be a different type of land steward. Not a very common scenario, but it is an option. Happens. I'd see more often it'd be properties in wildlife deferral where new owners want to do farm use. So it goes the other way around. And depending on the dwelling history, they may be able to go in farm deferral, they may not. Any
Perfect.
other questions?
Not right now.
What are we doing on time?
Oh, wait, sorry. One just popped in.
Okay.
Um,
Questions are
I
good.
know I know someone who had a deferral for feeding hummingbirds on their property. Does that fall under the wildlife deferral?
It might, again, that'd be a biologist question for them. I can tell you it is a qualifying farm use if you're raising honeybees for the sale of the bees or the honey.
No, hummingbirds.
Oh, hummingbirds, I'm sorry.
Hummingbirds.
Honeybees. I don't know. I think a
So
lot
that
of us
would be a
qualify
question
that.
for, okay.
Yeah. I could touch on the honeybees if you guys wanted to, but
Oh, yeah,
come back to, should we address it since it came up?
sure.
Kind of backs up to farm deferral. That is a qualifying farm use, not a common one, but it is a qualifying use. People that choose to do that, the problem with it is obviously the bees are going to leave. They're going to trespass your property. They're going to use your property and possibly leave your property. And so if you're going to do that, you do need to, the property owner needs to demonstrate how the bees are going to use your property as well. Are you going to plant certain plants for them? You're going to provide water, protection. You know, you're not just putting up the bee box, you're actually doing more than that. You're going to try to facilitate your property as well as neighbor, wherever they might go, are going to use your property as well. But it is a farm use. Okay. All right. Well, going on, we're doing pretty good. Going to go on to forest land deferral. Not an extremely common one for Deschutes County. This program was definitely mainly developed for properties on the west side of the Cascades. You know, large land ownership, timber ownership, timber companies, and to some degree Northeast Oregon as well. But the Department of Revenue did make this program eligible statewide. So I'll go over that. So to qualify for forest land deferral, the land must be held and used for the predominant purpose of growing and harvesting marketable tree species for timber products. Where we're at over here, that's mainly pine trees. As of now, juniper is not considered a marketable species. The property has to be at least 2 acres in size. It's eligible to properties that are zoned forest or other. I'll touch on that for in a minute, but the property also has to have enough trees to meet what's called the Oregon Forest Practice Act stocking and species standards. Basically, that means it has to have marketable trees and a certain amount on there. And the stocking standards, if you're just starting planting, I'm not going to go too much detail, but it basically starts, if you're starting, it has to be 100 saplings per acre. And as the trees mature, that number decreases. A property can still qualify if at the time of application, only a portion of the property meets the requirements. If at least 20% of the property has enough trees at the time, it can qualify if they follow up by submitting a forest management plan demonstrating how they're going to continue to plant the property to be at least planted 20% for for 20% for 5 years going forward. So if they show I'll plant this much the next year, and by 5 years the whole property will be planted, that would qualify them. If it's not zone forest, but still being used for forest use, they just have to submit an application that's called being designated as forest land. So they'd submit that to us along with the forest management plan. Now, land that would qualify for this forest land special assessment, it receives a special assessed value, and that's provided to our office by the Oregon Forest. It's an Oregon Forest Land Values that's certified by the Department of Revenue. And just to give you an idea for forest land values on this side of the Cascades, last year it was about $90 an acre. So if that land qualified, that's a pretty big reduction usually to assessed value on a property. So there's not a lot of these in our county, but if for a new owner, if they were to buy one, it's again tied to the land. So it comes with the property. They do not have to reapply in this scenario. We do try to send out a new owner questionnaire to them, asking them to submit a new forest management plan, which is something usually new owners have never done before. We can work with them on that. We can look at previous records we have on file for the property. There are forest land consultants around that people can reach out to get help with that as well. It's the management plan we ask them to fill out is not a complicated one. It's pretty straightforward. But what would require it to come out of forest land deferral? Well, most like the other ones, non-compliance. So if it was no longer being used for forest use, if they harvested all the trees and didn't replant, and they changed to a different use, that would kick it out. If they cut all the trees down to do farm use or something else, that would disqualify it. The non-farm dwelling can come into play on forest land deferral, kind of like the wildlife deferral in a way. But if the property is zoned EFU, but made application and got designated as forest land for assessment purposes because it's being used for forest land, if it got approved for a non-farm dwelling, that would require it to come out, much like an EFU zone property and farm deferral. If it's EFU zoned, but in forest deferral, gets a non-farm dwelling, it has to come out of come out of forest deferral, and the back tax is paid in full when they build the home. Of course, it can come out at the owner's request. Partitions do not disqualify. The newly created partitions, or newly created parcels can remain in the program as long as it's still being used for forest land use. Lot line adjustments would not disqualify. But the recording of a subdivision plat, that would result in disqualification. Disqualification would be a 5-year look back for the potential tax liability. We calculate the last 5 years of deferred taxes. And no leniency on that as far as not being due. That a disqualification for whatever reason would require those to be paid for that tax year. Same as the others though, it's who would be responsible? That involves the people involved. It's tied to the land. So it's up to the parties involved. If there are back taxes due, who would have to pay those?
We did have one question that popped up about that,
Yeah.
about the forest land deferral.
Okay.
Would wildfire take a property out of that deferral?
No, excuse me, that'd be considered an act of God. So, but they would have to replant after that to remain in, and that'd be up to them how they want to do that. They could do it all at once, or they have the option to do 20% of the property at a time, as long as that's done in 5 years, in a 5-year period. So they could plant 20% one year, 20% the next year, as long as it's done by 5th year. Or they could do, they could do half in 1 year and half the other year, but they would be required to replant after the fact. Moving on, if that's no more questions on those, move
Yep.
on to the other two.
Covered it.
Okay. Open space deferral, not a very common one, mainly because the potential tax liability can be quite large on these, and I'll get to that. But I'll start by qualifying. And let me disclaimer: open space deferral is different than what you might see called open space in a neighborhood or common ground or green space. That's different. That's land set aside in development. That's usually involves a homeowner association, and that kind of stuff usually is exempt from taxation, like open space and green space. This is different. This is open space deferral. It is eligible to all properties. They have to apply to our office, but we have to pass it on, depending where it is, And it's either going to be approved by the city councilors if it's in the city limits, or if it's outside the city limits, it's going to be approved by the county commissioners. So it'd have to be approved by them. And basically, if someone wants an open space, they're saying they want this property to remain unchanged in perpetuity. They want to set it aside for whatever personal reason they have to remain in its natural state. If it does manage to qualify, it receives a special assessed value based on the assumption that the highest and best use of the land is as open space. It may be the reality, maybe highest and best use is to be developed in a neighborhood, but for special assessment purposes, we have to assume that's not the case. So that results in a reduced assessed value on the property. For new owners, they would be required to reapply. So if a property and open space deferral changes ownership, they'd have to reapply, go through the process of either going in front of the city councilors or the county commissioners for them to approve it to remain in. But what would require it to come out or a disqualification? Well, basically any change of use away from its natural state as open space. Most recent example of this in our county would be a polished development called Rivervale a couple years ago. Prior to the development of Rivervale, that property had been in open space since the early 70s for a long time. So that kind of, basically any kind of change of use, a partition would disqualify it. They could reapply for open space to roll back into it after the fact. Whether they'd be approved or not is unknown. Same with a lot line adjustment. A lot line adjustment would disqualify it, but they could possibly reapply back for the program after the fact. Whether they'd get approved or not is kind of an unknown. The recording of the subdivision plat, like my Rivervale example, that would disqualify a property. So here's a big difference with this program is the potential tax liability on these, the back taxes. Excuse me. So if it came out of open space deferral, the back taxes are for the total amount of time the property has been in the program. And also about 8% of interest is applied for each year it's been out of deferral it's applied to those deferred taxes. And potentially, if our office is not notified of the change by the owner prior to the change of use to the property, we have to apply a penalty of 20% of the total back taxes applied. So it can add up pretty quick on these properties if they choose to opt out of the open space deferral and change the use of the land from what they originally intended it to be.
So
There's
for the
response-
open,
Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt. So for the open space, we have a question. Would that be something that could be a deed restriction?
Potentially, yeah, I'd say. It's that might play into the next program I'm talking about, because the open space deferral is by application by the owner. They're requesting our office to specially assess it. It's they're imposing the restriction on themselves by opting into this program, which means they can opt out at any time. So I guess I would say no, there's not a deed restriction. It's not a permanent restriction on the property. It's the property owners choosing to not change any use to the property. But again, they have the option to change their mind. If the people involved who wanted to put it aside are no longer around and they want to change it, the next of kin want to change it, that's an option they can do. Or they can sell the
So
property.
at any time they can change it.
At any time, yeah.
Okay.
As far as what that amount would be, to try to determine what that would be prior to the change, that's something that we calculate and update every year, and it's posted on our website on that account. So if you looked up a property in open space deferral, there'd be the notation that say open space potential additional tax liability and the dollar amount next to it, which means that's the amount that it would owe if it came out at that time. That's open space deferral. Any questions on that? Uh-oh, I don't hear you.
You're muted, Amy.
We had one more that came up, maybe not tied to the open space, but about the burn. Lane County changed much of the burn Mackenzie corridor zoning after the fires, and it became unbuildable. What steps would it take to contest that new zoning?
I don't think I can speak to that, unfortunately.
Yeah,
Because a zoning change is not an assessor's office
yeah,
responsibility. That's a planning department or commissioners involved in that.
got it.
Everything usually trickles down to our office. Decisions and approvals are made, and then after the fact that may affect assessment comes down to us. All right, I think I can squeeze in this last one here.
Definitely.
This is the relatively newest one, conservation easement special assessment. This is eligible to all properties, and to qualify, it starts by an application, of course, and there has to be a conservation easement recorded with the county clerk for the property or properties involved. Along with that, there has to be a holder or more, one or more holders of the property, which is an entity separate from the property owner that oversees the implementation of that conservation easement. So a separate party. An example would be here in our county, north of Sisters, it's an area called Rimrock Ranch. They applied years ago and they assigned the Deschutes Land Trust as to be the holders. So they met all the qualifications, and if a property like that qualifies, similar to the wildlife, it receives special assessed value as if it were in farm deferral. So overall result, reduction in assessed value, reduction in taxes. A new owner scenario, if it's sold, like most of the other ones, it comes with the property. It can transfer from owner to owner, and they do not need to reapply for that. Disqualification, why would it need to come out? Well, basically a failure, a couple reasons. Failure for the holder, the separate entity, failure for them to provide our office with certification that it's in compliance, and they're required to do that every 3 years. Or they can just notify us that it's not meeting the requirements, and we can take it out. Partitions, lot line adjustments, that potentially could disqualify the property unless that was already approved within the recorded conservation easement as something that may happen going forward. I got people peeking in, wanting my room here. I got recording the subdivision plat. Yes, that would take it out of conservation easement. Not too common. I don't have the exact details. The holder itself, like in this case, my example, the land trust, they have to meet a set of requirements that a lot of people or entities would not meet. So it's not the most eligible thing to achieve to find an entity that's willing to be the holder of something like this, but it is possible. If it came out, for potential back taxes, it's a 10-year look back on those, and whatever the reason it came out, those would be due at that time. Not tied to ownership, it's tied to the land, so we have no say who would be responsible for those. Like all the other ones, I can provide estimates what that might be, just for due diligence purposes, estimates or an exact amount on those. That was kind of quick on that one. That was it. I'll touch quickly on our public website, which I hope you guys use, our Dial website. Any property that's in any of those programs that I talked about is going to have in all caps a notation saying exclusive farm use potential additional tax liability, open space potential additional tax liability, forest land, whatever it is. That's a good indicator that the property is enrolled in that program. If there's a dollar amount next to it, that probably indicates that it came out at some time previous or recently came out and they may be due. So that's something you could reach out to our office and we could tell you what's the scenario with that. I also provided, you'll get this later, a list of property classes that show up on Dial as well. It doesn't say what that means on Dial. It's a tool we use, but I gave you a list of what that means, whether it's in farm deferral, EFU or non-EFU, forest land, or whatever the one I talked about could be. another tool you guys can use to just see if it's in a program or not. But of course, a quick call to us, which can always works too. Always glad to talk to you about what the tax status may be or on any of those properties.
So that was one of the questions that just came up is on dial, when we see there's a tax liability warning, how do we
Mhm.
find out what that is? Not sure how to find that. So that's literally just a call to you.
Yep, call to me. I can provide, an estimate of what back taxes could be. It's good to call too, because sometimes a property may be in the process of coming out, but it doesn't show that on dial yet. That's pretty rare, but that's one reason to check in. We may have been doing an audit. It might be about ready to disqualify. We don't know the property might be selling. If that's the case, we might want to work with the new owners on something, but a quick call or an email is always recommended, I would say.
Perfect. And then we had one more question on veterans exemptions. Is that your wheelhouse?
No, veterans exemption, I'll touch on it. If they do qualify, they have to be certified by a doctor, a certain percentage disabled. I don't know what that is. And that knocks off like around 25,000-30,000 of assessed value on a property.
So is there a specific percentage that it?
Yeah, there is. I don't know what it is. I don't deal with that. Yeah,
Okay.
but a doctor has to say, yes, this individual is certain percent disabled due to their service. Senior deferral, I don't deal with that either. But if that qualifies, I can tell you what I do know. If that qualifies, that does defer the taxes until that person who qualified passes. And then at that time, the next of kin is responsible for all those taxes that were deferred at that time. I don't know the ins and outs of what it qualifies. I think it has to do with personal income, how much that person has income. But our office, we have people that could answer that in more detail.
Okay.
But those aren't special assessments on my end. So.
I know you have to go right at 11, so we just have a couple other questions.
Yeah.
Non-exclusive EFU, you gave dollar amounts for income needed to remain in deferral. Are those amounts gross or net income?
Good question. Just gross. So that makes it easier. Just the gross income, not net. And I'll add to that, any given year we did an audit, it's for 3 out of the last 5. So there's always going to be 2 years in that the 5-year look back where you wouldn't have to meet that income requirement.
Another question, are ADUs going to be allowed and how would that affect land use? Not allowed on EFU, correct?
I don't think that's been approved yet for rural areas in Deschutes County on ADUs. Not really an issue as far as farm deferral and stuff. We may have to set aside another acre that's not in deferral, but if the rest of the property is approved, that's fine. The biggest factor is we're going to assess the ADU, and that's going to add tax value to the property, to the structure.
Yep.
But I don't really see ADUs as being a deferral issue.
Perfect.
Any conflicts there?
Mhm. Well, that concludes your presentation. Am I right?
It does.
Okay, perfect. Well, we really appreciate your time. Thank you for answering all of our questions. For our realtors joining us, again, you will have your CE certificates here very shortly within the week. Thank you for joining us. We will have a follow-up email that has all of Eric's contact information with any additional questions. We're getting a lot of thank yous to you, Eric, through the comments. I'm just seeing all those come in. So again, thank you for being here. And everyone should see some follow-up emails coming through. Diane, do you have anything you'd like to add? We're joined by Diane Ingersoll-Thorpe, one of our amazing escrow officers here at Western Title that many of you have worked with. And she works on these deferral situations all the time. Oh, whoops, you're muted, Diane.
Sorry, guys. I would just say, honestly, if we know the land use is changing or the deferral might be coming out and we have an open escrow, just to communicate that with us. So having that knowledge up front would be beneficial, I think, on your escrow team side. So that's probably the main thing. And we're willing to help in any way we can, working with the county and Eric and whatever we can do. So
Agreed, absolutely. Well, thank you everyone for being here. Again, we're always here. Any questions, anything that you need, you'll see emails from us this week.
Thank you. Thank you, Eric, for your time.
You bet.
Thanks,
Take care,
Eric.
everybody. You bet. Be in touch.